You're useless. You can't handle even basic household chores, let alone taking care of the children or financial issues related to payments to Alice. Rupert finally showed up at the hospital 3 weeks after my traffic accident. He spewed harsh and insulting words, without showing the slightest compassion for me, as if I was not a person in need of support at all, but something secondary. I was lying in a hospital bed, exhausted and broken both physically and mentally, hoping that he, my husband, would come to visit me to show at least some concern or care. But Rupert turned out to be just a disappointment. Taking a deep breath, I tried not to give away my thoughts, although they had long revolved around one thought: divorce. I didn't even expect him to bring up this topic right now, but apparently it's time. At that moment, I felt a kind of gratitude that it had saved us both from a number of unsolvable problems. When he proposed a divorce, I calmly agreed, which seemed to surprise him. Rupert clearly didn't expect me to accept his offer so easily. But little did he know that I was already one step ahead. At that moment, I even wanted to tell him that I knew about his plans long before his visit to the hospital, and this thought made me silently laugh at the situation. My name is Sarah. I am a 40-year-old housewife who lives with her husband Rupert and our 7-year-old daughter Lisa. Rupert and I met on a group blind date when I was 30. It was surprisingly easy to communicate with him, and pretty soon I fell in love. Rupert was an incredibly charming, attractive and charismatic man who attracted attention at our common table when we first met. When he showed interest in me, I felt flattered and proud. At the beginning of our relationship, Rupert was the epitome of romance: surprises, desserts, flowers, trips. He gave me a sense of significance. He was able to create a holiday out of every important day, from anniversaries to simple everyday life. Even after the wedding, at first he continued to maintain this sense of romance, but over time something changed. One day, after returning from work, he suddenly said, "Hey, Sarah, why isn't dinner ready yet? I work all day, and you can't even cook on time." His voice was full of reproach, and it took me a moment to realize that these words were not a joke. He began to make claims, as if I owed him as a servant, and not as an equal partner in marriage. When we got married, I had to quit my job at Rupert's insistence, and from that moment on, our lives depended solely on his earnings. I wasn't ready for this turn of events, but the inner fear of his threats kept me in line. It seemed that if I did not do as he demanded, he could deprive me of financial support at any moment, and this feeling of helplessness seemed to bind me hand and foot. Although it is ironic that his income was modest, when I worked, my earnings were much higher. Rupert barely graduated from high school and spent his whole life moving from one job to another, never staying anywhere for more than a year or two. This instability in his career was not only financially burdensome, but also, as I understood it, deeply undermined his self-confidence. Each of his dismissals turned into an invisible burden, which Rupert seemed to transfer to me. His irritation and frustration constantly found an outlet in his dissatisfaction with my actions, and I increasingly heard a caustic tone in his voice, as if I was to blame for his failures. One day, when I was late doing my chores, he responded coldly to my apologies. "Don't make excuses, just hurry up and do it." He sat down on the sofa, opened another beer and locked himself in his usual, cynical world. This scenario became commonplace, and every time I took a deep breath, starting to cook dinner or clean up, I realized that my marriage was gradually turning into a source of unhappiness. But I continued to live, trying to hold on for the sake of my daughter, Lisa, who was born a year after our wedding. With Lisa's arrival, my days turned into a continuous struggle. Not only did I bear the brunt of household chores, but I also tried to be a good mother to our daughter. As expected, Rupert showed little interest in Lisa's upbringing. However, he found a way to pamper her by buying sweets, toys, and other trinkets that she wanted. Whenever I tried to set boundaries for Lisa or punish her for something, she immediately ran away to her father, feeling in him a protector and guardian. It only deepened the gap between us. One day, watching this, Rupert proudly asked her, "Lisa, you love Daddy, don't you?" With delight in her voice, she replied, "Yes, Dad, you are the coolest, I love you." Smiling smugly, he glanced at me, enjoying his role as a hero in the eyes of his daughter. I felt powerless before this union, but despite the pain and disappointment, I couldn't help but rejoice that Lisa loves her father. However, despite the fact that he lavished gifts and attention on her, Rupert never showed any interest in her school life or important events. Lisa's kindergarten periodically hosted sports festivals where parents and children participated together, but Rupert was never there. On one of those days, I gathered my courage and asked him, "Do you know that there will be parent-child competitions at Lisa's sports festival? Could you take part?" His response was cold and harsh. "Why? I have a job every day, you know that." I tried to explain that the festival is a vacation, and it would be a great time for us as parents to spend the day with Lisa, but Rupert just waved me off irritably. "Shut up. I'm close enough to Lisa as it is. Maybe you should work on your relationship with her." His every word cut like a knife. He left for work without saying goodbye, leaving behind only the weight of unspoken words and resentments. I was increasingly worried that Rupert's habit of being condescending to himself but demanding of others would eventually affect Lisa. Despite the fact that all the worries about the house and the upbringing of my daughter lay with me, he continued to treat me like a servant. It seemed to me that his influence on Lisa became more and more noticeable over the years, because she saw in front of her an example of a person who took on only a small part of the responsibility, but at the same time expected others to do things perfectly. Lisa had already turned 5, and she was about to go to elementary school, and Rupert still couldn't hold down a job for more than a few months. He had just quit his job at the factory and found a new one at a food and beverage company. "Now I'm going to work on weekends," he said, as if this was an important achievement. "Well, a job is a job," I replied, holding back my relief. After all, his absence on the weekend gave me a long-awaited peace of mind. On the days when he was at home, I had to listen to his irritable comments, for example, how poorly I cook or how slowly I clean the house. Now that he's busy on weekends, at least I can avoid this constant pressure. But there was also a downside: Lisa. She could certainly miss him on those rare occasions when they could spend time together. "It's important for kids to have a weekend with their parents," I said, hinting that Lisa would be disappointed. However, Rupert was adamant. "I have a job. Tell her I won't be here." His voice sounded like it was the last straw of patience. I couldn't argue, because he was the one who brought money into the house, even if it wasn't enough. Gathering my courage, I went to Lisa to tell her that Dad would not be able to spend the weekend with her again. I expected her to be upset, because children are so sensitive to their parents' attention. But to my surprise, Lisa just shrugged her shoulders. "It's okay," she said. "If you don't mind, then I won't mind either." Her answer seemed strange to me, considering that she used to be so upset about Rupert's absence. "You know Dad won't be here all weekend, right?" Lisa added, and then suddenly said, "Dad has been smelling weird lately." I stopped, puzzled by her words. "A strange smell?" I asked, not quite understanding what he was talking about. Lisa nodded, and then, as if nothing had happened, returned to her toys. These words left me with an incomprehensible feeling of anxiety. What strange smell was she talking about? I was so busy taking care of the house and Lisa that I rarely noticed anything unusual in Rupert's behavior lately. Our marriage has long ceased to be what it used to be, and I tried to avoid unnecessary communication with him so as not to create conflicts. Perhaps the strange smell was a consequence of his work at the factory, because, as I knew, strong chemicals or solvents could be used there. That would explain a lot. However, my heart was still restless. This smell, which Lisa mentioned, began to persistently remind me of myself. I started noticing him every time Rupert came home. He brought with him a sweet, intense fragrance, and it was not related to his work. Why didn't I notice this before? After all, children never lie. They see and feel much more than we can imagine. Nevertheless, despite Lisa's words, Rupert continued to leave early in the morning, even on weekends, and returned with the same smell. One day my curiosity got the better of me and I asked him directly, "You seem to leave every weekend morning." Rupert hesitated for a moment, and I noticed a slight shadow of concern on his face. "I'm working," he replied, scratching his head with irritation in his voice. Actually, I volunteer to work on weekends. His answer seemed strange to me, and I immediately said, "But you need to take care of yourself, Rupert. You're already tired of the constant shifts." "Shut up. Don't complain about my work," he snapped. I was puzzled by his anger. After all, he often complained to me about his working conditions, fatigue, and dissatisfaction. Why did he react so sharply to my words? Intuitively, I felt that something was wrong. The man who has avoided responsibility and hard work all his life suddenly voluntarily began to go to work on his legal days off. I couldn't believe my eyes when I read those letters found in Rupert's room. It all seemed like some kind of bad dream story that can be seen in a TV series, but never expected in real life. Cornelia, this name flashed over and over again in every letter, as something out of place, alien in my house. At first I hoped it was just an old acquaintance, but the lines, "I'm glad you like me again," and "I'm waiting for our next date," killed the last remnants of hope in me. It wasn't just a friendly correspondence, it was a living, real betrayal. I tried to stay calm as I read the lines about how they were planning their next meeting, how he was enjoying his time with her. At that moment, I realized that in our house, where lies and deception reigned, I was the last one who still held on to illusions. I photographed the letters, hesitating to take them away. It might arouse Rupert's suspicions if he suddenly noticed their disappearance. But even with this evidence, I felt like I was missing something more significant. That night, I couldn't sleep for a long time, replaying in my head all the events of the last few months, his sudden early departures, strange behavior, those very weekends that he spent at work. It seemed that all this had now formed into a single, bitter picture. The next morning, having made a firm decision, I turned to a private investigator. I understood that this was a desperate step, but I needed to know the truth to the end in order to make a decision that was not based only on guesswork. 3 weeks had passed, and when the detective handed me the results, I was ready. He showed me photos of Rupert standing next to Cornelia and a recording of them exchanging words of love. These were not just random moments, they were moments imbued with the very feelings that I once hoped to see in my relationship with him. But now others have taken their place. I took it calmly. Strangely, a sense of relief washed over me, despite the fact that my heart was broken. With the actual evidence in hand, I went to the municipal government and filed for divorce. This time I had no doubts. After so many years of living in fear and insecurity, I finally felt like I could regain control of my life. When I returned home with the divorce forms, I took a deep breath. My hands were shaking a little, and even though I acted decisively, my emotions were tearing me apart. I was disappointed in myself for marrying such a careless man as Rupert, for allowing him to manipulate my life and destiny for so long. But there was no more regret, there was only a desire to finally be free. I was going to rest for a while before I started cooking dinner, when suddenly my phone rang. His father's name appeared on the display. It was unusual because my father rarely called for nothing. "Hi, Sarah. Do you have time to talk?" His voice was warm, but at the same time there was a certain solemnity in it. I was surprised, because our contact was quite rare. "Yes, of course, what happened?" I asked, not expecting to hear anything special. "Your mother and I talked yesterday and we think it's time to transfer our assets to you." His words came out of the blue. "What? But why so suddenly?" I couldn't hide my surprise. My father was the owner of a successful company that imported goods for large Japanese corporations. Despite our family wealth, I have always tried to keep a low profile, never discussing my roots with Rupert. In my eyes, that would be too boastful, especially considering his unstable job. "We're getting old, Sarah. We're thinking about retirement and we don't want to rush you, but we also don't want the company to stand still. You are our only daughter, and we decided it was time to step back, putting the management in your hands." These words startled me. On the one hand, I knew this moment would come someday, but on the other hand, everything was happening so fast. I suddenly realized that I was on the verge of major changes, not only in my personal life, but also in my professional one. When I heard Rupert utter these words with contempt, a strange mixture of relief and pain shot through me. I expected his reaction to be cold, but I didn't think he would show such outright cruelty. His face, distorted by contempt, left no doubt. The man I once loved was completely a stranger to me now. I was sitting in a hospital bed, helpless and vulnerable, but at that moment I felt an inner strength, the one that had been accumulating inside for years while I endured his nagging, his indifference, his infidelities. Rupert stood at the door, nervously stroking his phone, as if it was his only source of confidence in this room. I watched him with unexpected calmness. There was no seething anger inside me anymore, only a clear understanding that our marriage had long ago turned into an illusion that only tormented both of us. And so, when Rupert started talking about divorce, I realized that, despite all his harshness, he gave me the opportunity to end this painful stage of my life. Of course, I replied calmly, looking straight into his eyes. My confidence seemed to confuse him. He expected to see tears, to hear pleas to save the marriage, but I, on the contrary, seemed calm and collected, as if I had made a decision long ago. Rupert froze for a moment, his face contorted in surprise. He clearly didn't expect me to accept his offer so easily. It was a rare moment when he suddenly found himself unarmed, devoid of his usual arrogance and confidence. "Well," he muttered, a little confused, He stopped, as if he didn't know how to continue. He was embarrassed, and it annoyed him even more. I could see the uncertainty, almost fear, hiding behind his outward rudeness. But that fear no longer touched me. My heart was no longer reaching out to him as it used to, not looking for warmth or support. I looked at Rupert as if he were a man who had already become a memory, and I smiled inwardly. He did not even realize that my thoughts were about something else entirely, about how soon I would end this chapter of my life. I took out a small envelope from the bedside table, which I had prepared in advance. It was the same divorce notification document that I had brought from the municipal administration the day before. Having carefully filled out all the papers, I waited only for the right moment to hand them to Rupert. And now it has come. "Here it is," I said softly, handing him the envelope. He took it reluctantly, obviously not expecting me to be so ready to break up. His face reflected confusion again, as if he suddenly realized that he was no longer in control of the situation. "What is it?" His voice trembled with surprise when he opened the envelope and saw the official documents. He looked at me, and there was a mixture of bewilderment and resentment in his eyes. Have you already prepared everything?" I just nodded. For the first time in years, I felt free. With these documents in his hands, I could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Yes, this step was inevitable. And although my heart still ached from the recent betrayal, the future now seemed clear and bright. I knew there would be difficulties along the way, but I also knew that I had the support of my family, my daughter, and, most importantly, my strength. "Now you know what I'm up to," I said quietly, watching his reaction. When I heard Rupert begin to lay out his complaints, I was overcome by a wave of anger and bewilderment. He spoke with such arrogance, as if everything that had happened was just a minor misunderstanding that could easily be fixed. I felt righteous indignation boiling up inside me. He didn't even realize that everything had been destroyed for a long time, that our relationship could not be restored. His complaints about Cornelia, his dissatisfaction with her cooking and cleaning sounded so ridiculous that I could barely keep from laughing. "Are you serious, Rupert?" I finally asked in a restrained voice, which was a mixture of disappointment and irritation. "Do you really think you can just go back to the way it was? What can you forget about cheating, about your indifference, about all those years when you thought I was just a housekeeper?" He was silent for a moment, and then continued in the same tone, as if he hadn't heard a word of what I said. "Well, you know Cornelia can't cope. At least you had everything under control. And Lisa. She's better off with her father, right?" My hands were shaking with anger, and the phone felt heavy in my hand. I repeated his words, feeling a storm building inside me. "Do you really think Lisa needs a father like that? A father who had never been around, who had never helped with her upbringing? A father who thought more about himself than his own family? Do you really believe that she misses you? Rupert stopped talking, but I wasn't going to stop. The words were bursting out on their own, as if all these years of silence had now become unbearable. You don't understand anything, Rupert. Do you think money is all that matters? Do you think you can just go back and live like before, as if nothing had happened? No, Rupert, that's not going to happen. I left, and Lisa and I are living our lives now. And I'm certainly not going back to a man who didn't respect me or our family. I could hear his labored breathing on the other end of the line, but it didn't matter anymore. With every word I said, I felt the anger and pain that had been building up in me for years begin to evaporate, leaving room for clarity and relief. I finally said what I've been thinking all these years. You're talking about money, alimony, everything that you don't want to pay, I continued, but you know what? It doesn't matter anymore. I can handle it on my own. And Lisa, too. We don't depend on you anymore. And believe me, this is the biggest relief of my life. There was silence on the other end of the line. I imagined Rupert standing there, clutching the phone, realizing that his power over me had finally been lost. His ego, accustomed to control, could not accept that he no longer decides anything in my life. I'll sue if necessary, I said, ending the conversation, and you'll pay everything you owe. But this is the last thing that connects us. Remember that. With that, I pressed the end call button and closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. I felt my body relax, the tension leave me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt completely liberated. Rupert was no longer a part of my life, and now I could move on, focusing on what really mattered, Lisa, my future, and the freedom I had finally found. Every day when I wake up in my parents' house, I feel calm and peaceful, which seemed impossible in the past. There was no more room for the anxiety and tension that was always present with Rupert. I can just breathe, live my life and enjoy every moment, especially when Lisa is laughing merrily and running carelessly around the garden. Together, she and I began to build a new chapter of life, full of joy and bright moments, where she always came first. My parents supported me in everything. They not only provided us with a roof over our heads, but also helped to create an atmosphere of safety and warmth for Lisa. After so many years of being isolated and depressed with Rupert, I felt for the first time that I had the right to be happy. Every evening at the family table we talked, laughed, shared stories, and in these simple moments I found what I missed so much in marriage: real intimacy, sincerity, and care. Working in a flower shop, despite its incomplete schedule, brought me amazing satisfaction. I rediscovered the simple joys of touching fresh petals, the play of sunlight on colorful bouquets, the smells of flowers that filled the air. Customers often came for flowers for special events, birthdays, weddings, anniversaries. Each of them brought their own little story, their own piece of joy or sadness, and I was happy to be a part of these stories, even if only for a short time. The job made me feel needed, but at the same time, I knew that I was no longer dependent on anyone, and it gave me an incredible sense of freedom. I no longer had to justify myself or explain my decisions. I had financial independence, family support, and most importantly, Lisa's happiness, which filled me with strength. Every weekend Lisa and I came up with something new. An amusement park, trips to the zoo, or just walking along the beach, any of our activities turned into a holiday. We laughed and played, and in her eyes I saw the joy that I had wanted to give her for so long, the joy that she lacked when Rupert was around. Now we were free from his oppression, and this freedom allowed us to live our lives to the fullest. Sometimes I thought of Rupert, his cold words and ridiculous claims. But these thoughts no longer hurt, they no longer had power over me. Everything that had once held me captive was destroyed, and I knew that I would never let anyone take over my life again. I thought that maybe he would eventually realize how much he had lost. Perhaps he realizes that his mistakes and his indifference have led to such an end. But it didn't matter anymore. His life became distant and alien to me, and my thoughts about him gradually dissipated like morning fog, giving way to sunlight. Life went on, and every day it became brighter and more intense. I felt new dreams and new plans being born in me. I was no longer the kind of woman who was afraid of change. I was ready to face new challenges, knowing that I had the strength and ability to cope with them. Soon my leg will heal completely and I will be able to return to my profession. I dreamed of picking up a pencil again, starting to draw new projects, building houses that would bring joy to people. But for now, I was enjoying this time when I could just be a mother, a woman, free and happy.